Yeah, so I'm a philosopher of science, which means I just try to complicate things for the sake of finding the problems, poking the hole.
Hello, and welcome to another AMA where we're asking Dr. Aleta Quinn your burning questions. Aleta is a researcher in the history and philosophy of science and the 2024 Fulbright Canada-US Research Chair in Science and Society at the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. Welcome, Aleta. Thank you so much for answering all our questions.
Thank you so much for asking me. I'm delighted to be here.
So first off, I think the most important question and the forefront of everyone's mind is, what is the philosophy of science?
Yeah, that's fair. So what we do is we try to understand how science works. We're interested in what justifies particular claims that are made within science. So that includes theoretical claims about things you can't see directly, and that includes also processes of inference and reasoning, and also critiques. We also do a lot of analysis of concepts, which what we find sometimes is when someone is using the same term as other folks are using, they might actually be referring to a somewhat different thing without that meaning difference being fully clear.
That's really interesting. So it's kind of like what is a fact, what makes something a fact.
Yes, that's fair. And indeed, one of the sort of founders of philosophy of science, William Whewell, he started his main treatise with a discussion of like what is a fact and what is a theory and what is their relationship.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I think that's really important because I feel like even in everyday life, sometimes we use the same words, we realize, wait, we're not really understanding the same words in the same way. We have different assumptions about it, and it causes misunderstandings sometimes before we can really peel back and be like, oh, this is where it all began.
Yes, exactly. So philosophy is like that, and then philosophy of science is that specifically with respect to scientific claims.
You also study the history of science, and that for us as RCIScience is a really cool connection because we've been around for a really, really long time. We were founded in 1849, so this was before Canada was a country, and even before Darwin's Origin of Species was published. Early on, as an institute, we published a lot of journals to advance science, and we had papers on botany and zoology and chemistry and all the things in between. So, what's really interesting about our centennial volume that was published, which was written by the librarian of the University of Toronto, W. Stewart Wallace, it suggests that early attempts were made at describing and cataloging plants, but the description aimed only at making the plant recognizable, and such cataloging was in the form of regional lists or on the basis of usefulness in agriculture or medicine. And then he says later, as a science, botany began to group plants based on relationships instead, which was then also affected by the dogma of the constancy of species. Can you talk about the larger context behind how we categorize living things?
So the particular science that I've mostly studied throughout my career is in fact taxonomy, or now phylogenetics, which is basically just the systematic study of biodiversity and what species are there and how they're related to each other. So I would say that's a really great question. I was just earlier today corresponding with my colleague Polly Windsor at Toronto. One of the things that she has pointed out, she was part of a retelling of the history of taxonomy that actually gets at one point you mentioned in there, dogma of the fixity of species.
Yes.
So what a lot of folks don't realize actually is, as far as we as historians can tell, it looks like that dogma is actually fairly recent. So one of the projects that I did at one point, I looked at histories of biology that were written in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I would say Linnaeus made two major contributions. First, he popularized and standardized a system of names and naming conventions. And then second, he fixed species. He made it so that people understand that species don't transmute or just transform into lots of different things. Because it turns out before the 1700s, when Linnaeus was working, there were just all sorts of beliefs about how organisms and lineages could hybridize or could arise from nothing or could combine, or you could have different organisms coming from each other and you'd have lineages, and what we would call species would change in all sorts of ways. And it was very chaotic. So when Linnaeus said, actually, there's a finite set of species and they all breed true, that was actually a scientific advance at that time, or so historians have argued. That episode is like helpful in terms of thinking about how science works. What we now consider a faulty view that species are fixed, at one point was actually a scientific advance to come to that understanding. And the reason is because in order to even have a concept of a natural classification, a set of relationships amongst species, it has to be some level of stability. This can be compared to actually what happened with the story of chemical elements, which, if you think about what is a chemical element, what it was defined as by the people who sort of put the concept together, it's a fixed entity, just the way species were thought to be fixed. So what that means is if you've got, say, table salt, you have sodium chloride, you can do all sorts of different things to it. You can dissolve it in water or bake it in a cake, try to set it on fire. But it's sodium chloride. The sodium has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear or turn into something else. The chlorine has to go somewhere. It doesn't disappear or turn into anything else. And it's only once you have a fixed entity like that that you can start putting together, well, which are the elements that exist and how are they related to each other? And, oh, hey, these ones, they seem similar. And eventually you can put together a periodic table. Fast forward, along comes Marie Curie, and with Pierre Curie, they discover radium and some other things. And hey, it's a new element. By the way, it decays into other elements, does so all the time. And everybody was like, cool, please have a Nobel Prize or two. What had to happen then is you take your understanding of what it is to be an element had to change, but it was necessary to have that understanding in order to get the periodic table, to discover all these other elements, and to come to a better understanding of what's actually going on there. To me, that's the really cool picture, big picture component of looking into history and philosophy of science.
That's really interesting because I'm thinking about, when we were in school and learning these theories in those stages almost, how it was found out historically. And I remember hearing the frustrations of other students of like, why didn't we just like learn how it is?
Yeah.
Why do they keep pulling the carpet from under our feet? Yeah, how do you reconcile that frustration?
There's the frustration of like, why can't they have just gotten it right? But then also the next level frustration of like the way science works, they had to have a somewhat imprecise concepts that actually involved some things that we now think are totally wrong in order to get to a better theory. And so you mentioned Darwin. That's another great example because there were many things in Darwin's 1859 publication which we now think were not correct. From his perspective, the elements included in the different versions of his theory were necessary. Us looking back, we see that there was a great conceptual advance there, and there was a lot of stuff that was correct, but there's also things that are just downright wrong. And in the big picture, that is part of how science works.
Right. We're just getting closer and closer to what it is, but it's not necessarily like we're just getting it wrong all the time. And it feels directionless, but it's not actually
Right.
directionless.
It's sometimes I think it's better to think instead of thinking as zooming towards the truth, instead think like we're getting progressively less wrong is what's happening.
I like that. Getting progressively less wrong. I feel like it should be science's tagline.
I should also say a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is sort of my view and is
Right.
maybe not shared by all philosophers of science.
That's an important disclaimer. Thank you for sharing. I know that you're an avid herper, so you, correct me if I'm wrong, look for amphibians and reptiles in the wild.
Yes.
So I thought it would be fun to play a game in between our questions. Dr. Erin McGee is at Afro_Herper on X or Twitter. And she started this really fun game called Find That Lizard. And she shows a photo of a lizard camouflaged in the natural environment. Her captions give kind of cool facts about the reptile that might help you find it. So would you like to do one round right now?
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay.
No promises, no confidence. No, yeah.
All good. There is no pressure. I know that these can be really tricky. So our first one is the ornate tree lizard. All right, here is the picture.
Oh boy.
This one's tricky.
Okay, I'm gonna guess dead center, the very center of the photo. It is on top of that sort of orange patch. It's looking diagonally up and to the left.
I'm going to show the answer.
Okay.
Is that what you were thinking?
Yes, and there is no way I would have gotten that except it's right at the center of the photo.
So I think you're off to a really good start. You should feel optimistic for the upcoming rounds.
Now I'm feeling pressure now.
No worries. I mean, it's a difficult challenge, so no one should feel discouraged. I think it's a really fun game, and hopefully can inspire people to go find lizards in their area. Have you found any lizards? You've been in Ottawa for a little bit. Have you found any while you've been out and about?
So it's been, I came here in January, and it's kind of tough to find lizards up here before spring. So actually yesterday I found some salamanders, so that was pretty cool.
That's really cool. Amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
well, we're going to have to ask you for tips later on. For our next question, actually, we looked through a lot of our early journals, and they feature contributions from local high school teachers, and they're showing illustrations of microscope observations that they found of plants and animals. Can you speak to how and why that has changed? I don't think we really see contributions from local high school teachers anymore.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting time, right around when sort of the professionalization of science was occurring. And actually, the person I mentioned earlier, William Whewell, invented the word scientist in 1833. I wrote that down to make sure I didn't mess anything up. Part of the answer is going to have to do with professionalization, but part also is going to have to do with the types of skills and activities that are happening in schools. What I think is really interesting from my current research perspective, I've become interested in citizen science lately, which very roughly is the participation of people who are not professional scientists in scientific research as contributors. So they're not being studied, but they are contributing, whether that's data collection, or in this case, a representation, which is a really difficult skill. I know that now there's entire profession, scientific illustration, because you have to be cognizant of which are the important aspects of the organism to be represented and how to represent them. In terms of citizen science, I think it's interesting to realize there has been some publicity about the concept lately, but there's all sorts of examples like this going back historically. I'll go back to Whewell one more time. He was interested in the tides, and so he developed worksheets that he sent all around the world so that people could send in observations of what was happening with the tide in their particular location. To me, my present research concerns databases and internet platforms that can really facilitate that type of contribution. And the possibility of this contribution has changed or remains the same. And questions about what constitutes expertise and how do we recognize different forms of expertise in this context of people who are not professionally employed as scientists contributing scientific research.
I think we think about citizen science, at least from my perspective, it feels like a newer concept, but clearly it's been around for a long time, especially when travel wasn't really as easy. You couldn't go around the world as much. So that's fascinating to think about, and really, I think, recontextualizes this whole concept of citizen science. And it's interesting that you note about, this is kind of where science is starting to be professionalized, because there's another line in our centennial volume that says the day of the professionally trained zoologist is still many years in the future. So they're, at that turning point where they're recognizing that they need universities and specialized training. So can you speak a little bit more to sort of today's world in terms of who can science be done by, and how does that affect the science, the way that science is done and the results that we get?
Yeah, so it's interesting what you say about this concept of citizen science having a moment. I'm not sure exactly when the term was coined. Some folks prefer participatory science or community science, but the question of who can contribute and through what means. So technology has enabled a lot of contributions. There are some major online databases where you can contribute an observation of a lizard or a salamander, and digital cameras. That was a pretty important moment there too, that it used to be quite expensive to be taking all these photographs of things to try to make a contribution. It's comparatively less expensive now. And so these technologies are enabling more contributions. I've also been really interested in different knowledge communities, and in particular in hobby communities, where you find a great deal of expertise associated with, for example, herping as a hobby, that in order to be able to find snakes or lizards, you have to learn quite a lot about them. And depending how avid the hobbyist is, they end up learning just an enormous amount of things, not from books, but just from time in the field and trying all sorts of things in order to find these organisms. But one thing I'll mention is I am just now reading a book by a colleague about gamifying certain forms of scientific question. That basically he was interested in how can we prevent or treat cancer, and what can be done in order to contribute to that question, which is a huge and enormously difficult question with many sub-questions. And what he's been doing is thinking in terms of take some of those sub-questions, translate them into games involving puzzles that then just individuals can play and take advantage of the sort of human cognitive capacity of enjoying puzzle solving, as well as like the gaming community has a lot of interest and gets good at solving puzzles, and how that can be harnessed in a way which is potentially extremely beneficial. There's a lot of different places where you see contributions.
That's really cool that you say that, because we had a video come out and we were playing Borderlands, the video game, and it also has a little mini game that was developed in part by a researcher at McGill University, looking at the human gut microbiome, and it was all of these puzzles that helped them sort through the data. So it was really interesting to hear that, there are more and more avenues on that front, and kind of making use of games and how popular they are now.
Yeah. So there's a couple platforms where people can contribute. If you do see a lizard or a snake, you can go to iNaturalist.org. You can go to Herpetological Education and Research Project. There's HerpMapper. For the birding community, eBird, an extremely large platform. They have close to 2 billion observations, data points that have been contributed by people, most who are not employed as scientists professionally. The eBird project was launched by Cornell University, but it was actually inspired by an earlier platform and citizen science effort that was organized by some birders in Quebec. So I thought that was quite cool.
Yeah, that's a great Canadian connection. And also, now that you're mentioning, herping and birding, let's do another round of Find That Lizard.
Okay.
So the next one is the Western Whiptail Lizard, somewhere on this.
Oh, okay. Yes, there it is. It's also in the center. It's behind the the sticks, pretty much dead center of the photo. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of blends in, doesn't it?
Yeah,
right there.
This is how a lot of my photographs look.
Okay.
The camera is yes, that's a very interesting twig.
I remember reading about sort of the conception of this Find That Lizard game, and she's talking about how anything is a lizard when you're starting out, like a rock, a twig, a branch, they're all lizards.
Yeah.
For those of us who are intrigued but have never done herping before, what are your tips for people starting out?
So the first and most important thing is absolutely anything you do in search of herps, don't mess up the habitat. How to find them? You have to sort of figure out the types of places they would like to be at any point in time. What sort of a day is it? Is today a snake day, or is today more of a frogs hanging out in the pond? So basically, think like the organism. More practically, there are actually some really cool books that are like an introduction to the hobby. And there's also a lot of local clubs, meeting societies, and increasingly there are groups on social media that if you can sort of lurk for a while and pick up tips and ask questions and sort of learn the hobby side of things. There's also a whole etiquette to it. It can be a little rough getting started, maybe figuring out the sorts of questions to ask.
That's great to know. And yeah, I always find that it's helpful when you are with people who know what they're doing. That's the easiest way, I think, to get into it. Moving on to our next question. We've often heard, the phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, as well as science is a social enterprise, which are kind of a little conflicting, not fully, but do you have any thoughts on either of those phrases?
Yes, and there specifically about that squishiness that you just expressed there. There's a number of suggested dichotomies going on here. I would suggest that there's a tendency for folks to think in terms of rationality as being inherently opposed to emotion in a way that I'm not sure makes sense, certainly not always. There's a dichotomy between the rational and the social. And so sometimes, I have heard some folks express that, like, yeah, science is social, but it'd be great if it didn't have to be. It'd be great if scientists were robots, and so they don't have emotions, and it's also not really a social interaction anymore. But I'm not actually sure that that would be the best. And here I'm drawing on work of some other philosophers of science that breaks down some of these apparent conflicts and shows that, actually, in some cases, the fact that science is social can contribute to scientific objectivity because some of the social processes that scientists engage in are specifically really good at ferreting out error. And in particular, like lots of the social institutions associated with science, whether that's peer-reviewed journals, presentations, conventions on authorship, they function fairly well to subject claims about the world to scrutiny, so that if one scientist has a view that they're strongly attached to, the social processes are that there will be criticism from others in the scientific community. And so really the social processes are a way of, in the long run, helping each other out and helping us find ways that, like, we have this scientific knowledge claim. How can we throw that against the world? How can we test that? How can we confirm or disconfirm? And an argument is made that over time, through the functioning of these social interactions, if things are going well, then the individual biases that one scientist might happen to have, of whatever type of bias, they can sort of get washed out, like as people within scientific communities interact over time. And so that, in my view, is like a really important idea about, again, going back to the big picture of like what exactly science is and how it works.
That's really interesting. My next question is that in our centennial volume, Wallace claims it has been natural for man to study himself more intensively than any other animal, so that special sciences such as anatomy and physiology have been developed for man before being extended to animals, which from my interpretation seems to imply that we generally care more about ourselves than other living things. How does this relate to why we care about biodiversity on either the personal, scientific, or policy level?
That is a great question, yeah, because I take Wallace's point there to be we care more about ourselves, and by extension, we care more about things that are connected to us or that we feel connected to or that are more similar to us. And you see that in the history of taxonomy with more sort of attention being paid to groups that resemble us in various ways as opposed to, say, microbes. That was a very broad claim, by the way, covering hundreds of years.
Yeah.
What's really, to me, interesting is folks have talked about biological diversity for some time, but the concept biodiversity and that term came into being and was sort of launched into the world and popularized with specific intentions in mind. And part of it was that there was concern about the natural world, the environment, environmental destruction and degradation, and the loss of biological diversity. But a lot of the attention had been on organisms that are fairly similar to us, that we feel some kind of connection to, the charismatic megafauna. So panda bears, certainly the great apes, and also things that just really impress us, lots of large things. And there was concern that we should also be extremely concerned about other types of biological diversity. So other sorts of organisms, organisms in general, also genetic diversity, diversity of ecological processes and ecosystem functions. The concept of biodiversity was to sort of encapsulate that we should be concerned with biodiversity wherever it is found, and it is found in many different places and levels, and it can be measured in all sorts of different ways. So something like the flow of nitrogens through a marsh, that could be a way of measuring the function, and then correlate that with biodiversity in terms of species richness, or in terms of genetic richness, or in terms of ecological richness. You make all these choices, and those things that I just mentioned are relatively straightforward to conceptualize and find some kind of a measurement instrument. On the other hand, the concept of biodiversity is also playing a role in arguments about what we should do and what we should care about, and has this function of getting us to see the value in ecosystem service, and whether that's monetary terms, or whether it's aesthetic, which it's going to be really, really hard to figure out what's a number for aesthetic. And by aesthetic, I mean not just it looks cool, but it has some kind of emotional impact on us. The way things are going and systems are destabilizing, it appears that biodiversity will be helpful to us in the future. Those things, those types of value, are like much more resistant to like a conceptualization and measurement. And so the biodiversity concept is just enormously complicated because it has all these functions and all these different dialogues, and it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, it must be hard to fully encapsulate that. Does that make it harder then because of all of these different value systems, or the way that we need to value biodiversity in all these different ways, to make it challenging to address biodiversity and in tandem climate change?
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher of science, which means I just try to complicate things for the sake of finding the problems, poking the hole, find the places where there might be ambiguities. But the flip side of this is like biodiversity has, as a concept, has done really well in terms of like facilitating a lot of different dialogues and helping people to clarify, how their value systems connect to different aspects of the natural world. And so I kind of really think like the enormous complexity of the concept is an anchor or a framework that can enable all these different conversations.
That's really fascinating and encouraging to hear. Do you see this? Maybe this is a really big question, but being able to be applied to other global challenges that we have?
One of my colleagues works on food security, and actually the shift to talking about food systems and food sovereignty, and the many different ways that food is valued and important beyond just sort of a storehouse of calories type of approach. Another example is health. We need to have an entire field of biomedical ethics concerned with what exactly is health, and how does that translate to individuals. And you can track as well different ways that different organizations have defined these terms over time, and how they've changed the definitions and why. And so I do think there's definitely a role for this sort of scrutiny of concepts in understanding the very significant global challenges that we face.
That's really helpful, and yeah, hopefully other people can find some hope in that. And we had another question get submitted about the Convention on Biological Diversity, in terms of what kind of document is that in the context of pure science?
I'll give two answers, neither of which will be satisfying. The first one is that concept of pure science. One way of looking at things is that the role of science is to identify claims about the world as it really is in ways that we can like tinker with the world. A concept like biodiversity is intended to serve as some kind of property of the world that we can affect in various ways. And then science gives us conceptual tools to do that, and then some applied science can be value laden in that way if just there's a directionality to it. We're trying to move the lever in one direction, right? Same thing with health. You're trying to increase health or to mitigate the impacts of poor health. But I'm skeptical of that sort of framework for distinguishing pure science from applied science. I'm not sure that's the right way to think about things. And then also, the way I see a just sort of big picture is the biodiversity concept is a way of sort of dealing with that question and all the really complex issues to do with, what is pure science, what is applied science. But we can talk about biodiversity. So it's a shared framework, and it's one that can be talked about by professional scientists doing science, whether it's pure or applied. And it's also a thought space that can communicate with policymakers and can communicate with the general public. So again, I see this document, I see them as like creating a shared space to connect these ideas and conversations.
I really like that, and I think it kind of highlights too what we were talking about at the beginning about, how sometimes we use the same words and we have different understandings of it, but here, we're able to create this shared space. That's a really beautiful bow on that. All right, let's do another Find That Lizard challenge. So the next one is the Western banded gecko.
Oh, pretty sure I found one of those last spring working with a citizen scientist friend of mine.
That's awesome.
Tip on how to find that lizard: go looking
Yes.
at night. So they will be more active at night, and which means your photos are probably, not necessarily as good.
Yeah, good
in
to
my
know.
case.
Nighttime excursion, I see.
Oh wait, I'm supposed to be looking for the gecko. Where's the gecko? Okay, I concede defeat.
That's okay. I mean, I think the reason some of these are so hard is they like camouflage really well with their environment. I also struggle to find this one. It's right there. The little, I think you only see the head.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's my favorite.
That's your favorite?
Yeah, just because you can only see one part.
So let's move on to a couple more questions before we wrap up. Why do you think people should care about philosophy of science?
It's interesting to me that I see memes on social media with folks saying every person should have to take a class on critical thinking and every person should have to take a class on scientific literacy. And I think, okay, yes, I agree. But what do we mean by scientific literacy there? And like to some extent, you want content, right? So it'd be great if people have a basic education and understanding of how nature works. But really, I think the spirit behind these memes that people are spreading, it's like, we want people to have a basic understanding of how science works, scientific literacy in the sense of understanding that science, it's not just a blob of claims or sentences. It is, it's a social process mentioned, but what are the processes of scientific inference and how the scientific claims get made and tested and critiqued? That is precisely what philosophy of science tries to address. Philosophy of science is about getting really, really clear about what exactly terms mean and how they are being used. And when they are being used, how do they relate to the process of inference and the chain of reasoning, to basically reconstruct a chain of reasoning in a very precise, non-ambiguous way to the extent that we can. And that, to me, is critical thinking, right? You need to do that in order to assess, like, is this chain of reasoning actually well justified, or is there some confusion in it, or does it not have sufficient justification. And so I think that, yes, and people should care about philosophy of science in that sense. Whether you call it philosophy of science, I don't really care. And
Right.
whether you say everybody should know about the existence of the discipline, I don't really care.
The things that you've said just now, I hear remnants of that from, the pandemic when people were talking a lot about science and how that works. And yeah, it's becoming increasingly important to engage in that type of thinking and in those conversations as well. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And what have you learned from your time here at the Institute in terms of the connections between science, society, and policy?
I think what I've learned is just the importance of meeting people where they are, because in my time here, I've been interacting with folks with a really wide variety of backgrounds. What I have been finding is that whether you're discussing taking some science and getting it to policymakers in a way that is going to be usable, in a way that is completely authentic to the science and honest, that's an enormously difficult skill, but it's absolutely crucial. And the way to do that is to, or such is my impression, is to find ways of making connections. And rather than trying to lecture for 2 hours about my view on what this particular thing is, but instead to find the areas of common ground and ways of framing options and strategies that will make sense, I think is super important when thinking about the intersection of policy and society as well.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and we at RCI Science love that concept as well. We work hard to try to meet people where they're at, and are looking for ways to do that always. Just to wrap up, do you have a favorite memory from the field?
Yes, so I have very many. I'm never going to tell one amphibian that they're my favorite because they're all my favorites. A recent memory that is really very dear to me. I wanted to see if I could find a frog in a county that one of the databases that I contribute to, there haven't been any records from that county yet. And so I went to that county, Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry United Counties, and I was able to position myself in a wetland. The wood frogs were calling, which is awesome because it's still pretty early. They go very early, but I was like, yes, spring is here. And so I got my observation. I managed to get an acceptable photograph with about 20 minutes to spare, because then I just stood there listening to the wood frogs call as it got somewhat darker and it started to get cold. And then totality hit. And I freaked out, and the wood frogs freaked out. They stopped calling entirely, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
And I've never seen an eclipse before from the totality zone. So that is a recent favorite memory from the field.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's an amazing memory. We also had an event with the eclipse and a nature aspect as well, and seeing how animals reacted to the eclipse. That's so cool. And I love that you have this experience to share.
It was awesome. I could hear people all over were cheering, and yeah.
Yeah.
So cool.
I think that was like a really fun aspect of like you knew it was happening because people were all cheering for it. All right. Thank you so much for your time.
That was a really great set of questions. So just again, thank you for doing this.
No problem. Yeah, thank you so much for your insights and all of the beautiful things that you had to share. I really enjoyed our time together, and I'm glad you found most of our lizards. And yeah, thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Ottawa.